I had just finished an evening shift, and I enjoyed the walk home under a magnificent, almost full moon that dimly illuminated my path ahead. In my hand, I held a bottle of Bordeaux, excited for dinner prepared by my wife Sarah. She'd already left me a text saying she'd almost finished up, and that my dog eagerly waited my arrival, tapping around the floor in our home, wondering what took me so long. The road home took me past a riding school, with about a dozen horses spending their night in the adjacent fenced field. I frequently stopped by to feed them a snack, carrots or apples mostly, and as such, we'd formed a sort of friendship. But something seemed off that evening. Usually, the curious creatures would come trotting over, ecstatic if they noticed me carrying food. But instead of their neighing greetings, they ignored me, their eyes transfixed by the bright moon above. I tried the usual clicking sound to attract their attention, but they didn't even seem to take notice of my presence, and after a few moments of staring up at the sky, in a futile attempt at figuring out what they found so damn interesting, I gave up and continued home. My dog Hugo, a massive Labrador who still acted like a lapdog, excitedly jumped up to greet me as I walked through the door. He almost knocked me to the ground, barely allowing me to save the bottle of wine I held. Sarah quickly came to my aid, hopelessly trying to pull him off, an almost impossible feat once Hugo had entered his aggressive cuddle mode. But after a few wet licks and some paw marks off my white shirt, he calmed down thanks to the temptation of a promised dog snack if he behaved. The horses were acting weird tonight, I said with a mouthful of pork chop.
What do you mean, weird?
Sarah asked. They just completely ignored me, just stared up at the moon. She gave me a concerned look, before glancing over at Hugo.
That's odd. Same thing happened as I took the dog out for some fresh air, just before you got back home. He wouldn't stop staring up at the sky. I had to drag him back with me.
Well, that's different. Hugo is clearly an idiot, I said as I gestured to our dog, laying with his snout half submerged in his water bowl, producing bubbles with each breath. Sarah giggled, and we went about our dinner, doing our best to just enjoy our weekly date night with wine, dinner, and a boring movie. The next evening following work, I once again passed by the riding school, this time making sure I was carrying with me a bag of irresistible goods for the majestic horses. I figured they'd been sulky last night, since I passed by without a worthy offer. Yet they still stared up at the moon. I stood by their fence for a few minutes, clicking at them, holding out tasty carrots, even throwing some at their feet. They just kept staring, their attention locked at the shiny, celestial body above us. Eventually, it started to get cold, and I headed back home. As I arrived, I found Hugo standing in our garden, his eyes fixed at the sky, with Sarah desperately trying to drag him inside, all the while spouting profanities at our massive idiot. But he refused to budge. Sarah, what's going on?
This dumbass won't come back inside,
she panted as she pulled at his leash with all her force. I bent down to pet Hugo, hoping some love would convince him to move his chubby behind. He growled at me as I reached out my hand, shocked at his sudden change in attitude. I bent down to try again, but instead of his cuddly self, he bit me. Hugo bit me. Though it wasn't a particularly hard bite, one that didn't even break the skin. It was still the first time he had any sort of aggressive behavior towards us, or anyone for that matter. He'd always been a peaceful, if not a bit docile creature. In anger, I grabbed his collar and started dragging him back into the house. All the while he barked and growled in defiance. We put him into his travel cage for the night and locked the door, so he could lay there and think about what he'd done. We went to bed angry, discussing what to do about Hugo's sudden outburst. Call a vet, enroll him into classes, or just take it as a one-time event. He'd always been the most loving being, so something was most definitely off. Then, as we awoke the next morning, ready to give our dumb dog another chance, we found him laying still in his cage. He always, without fail, jumped up once he heard our footsteps approaching him in the morning. But on that particular day, he just lay there. "Hey, boy, wake up," I said as I opened the door. But still, he wouldn't move. It didn't take long for realization to hit me. Hugo was dead. He'd passed at some point during the night, only 7 years of age. We cried as we embraced his limp body in our arms. He'd been a large dog, but he had never felt that heavy, reduced to a furry bag of meat with no personality inside. I called in sick to work, but my wife didn't get the chance as they were understaffed. After she unwillingly left, I took the time to bury Hugo in the garden, telling him I forgave him for biting me, and that he was the best dog anyone could ever have, and that I loved him. Following the burial, at 10 in the morning, I cracked open a beer and decided to watch some television. Any distraction was a welcome gift. I flipped through the channels filled with daytime crap until I stumbled upon a local news segment regarding the riding school. The very same I passed by every day to and from work. During the night, all of their 16 horses had fallen over dead, and just like with Hugo, there was no apparent cause. It was like they'd just stopped living out of sheer willpower. I knew it had to be related, and feared the horses might have died from some sort of infection, maybe one that I'd carried with me home and transferred to Hugo. Feeling more than a bit guilty, and with limited medical knowledge, I called the veterinarian, half sobbing as I asked if I'd somehow killed my own dog. The woman on the other end of the line sounded tired, exhausted from an overnight shift, and explained that no disease would carry over from equines to canines with a healthy human as the carrier. She continued to say that it was a citywide situation, with pets and local wildlife falling over dead, and no one could fathom why. Due to this, the city was about to order all pets to be kept inside while they could assess the situation. But for us, it was already too late. Sarah came home in the evening from an overtime shift. Apparently, quite a few of her co-workers hadn't turned up for work, even without calling in sick, and she had to stay behind to pick up the slack. She'd brought flowers for Hugo's grave, and while she took the time to say goodbye, I cooked up some dinner, hoping to brighten the mood ever so slightly. As the pasta reached the perfect al dente consistency and the sauce simmered in the pan, I realized that Sarah still hadn't come back in. I walked out into the garden to find Sarah at Hugo's grave, but she wasn't there to say farewell. She simply stared up at the moon, unmoving, no care as to what was happening around her. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I asked, concerned. She didn't respond. "Sarah, come on!" I said, my voice getting louder as I walked over to her. Still no response. I grabbed her shoulder, which caused her to violently flinch in shock, as if I'd snuck up behind her to scare her. She seemed frazzled, but at least I got her attention.
Oh shit, oh, I'm sorry. I kinda spaced out there for a second. Is dinner ready?
Yeah. What were you looking at, Sarah?
What do you mean?
You were just staring up at the sky. Just like Hugo, I said calmly, as I realized how stressed out she seemed.
No, I just zoned out.
It's all right, Sarah. Let's just eat. We finished dinner in silence, and went to bed without discussing Hugo, nor what happened to my wife. Something about her felt different, broken, but I couldn't decide whether she'd seen something in the sky, or if she was just distraught from the loss of our dog. I twisted and turned in bed that night, unable to rest, drifting in and out of consciousness, a dreamless sleep filled with nothing but worry. At some point, I reached out my arm and realized Sarah's part of the bed was vacant, a realization that quickly jolted me awake. After running through the house, calling out for her, I caught a glimpse of someone standing out in the garden, staring up at the sky. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing?" I yelled as I ran over to her, ready to drag her back inside. But before I could even reach her, she collapsed on the ground. "Sarah!" I ran over to check on her, and though she was still alive, I couldn't get her to regain consciousness. Without further hesitation and with trembling hands, I called 911, impatiently awaiting a response. It rang for a full minute, and there was no one on the other end to respond to my call. 2 minutes, then 3, then a 4th minute of waiting without an answer. I hung up, deciding I would drive her to the hospital on my own. I sped through our little town, noticing a few passed-out people lying on the side of the street, all in various states of undress. Nightgowns, naked, fully clothed. Whatever the situation, something was terribly wrong. As we arrived at the hospital and pulled into the drop-off meant for ambulances, I was shook by the oddly silent atmosphere surrounding the area. Only a single doctor came out to assess the situation. "Where the fuck is everyone?" I asked as I carried my unconscious wife out of the car. The doctor looked stressed, but not surprised, clearly overwhelmed by whatever was happening during the night. He quickly looked over my wife, checking for any sign of consciousness.
"Come on,"
he finally said.
"Let's get her inside."
The hospital seemed void of any staff, only operated by a minute skeleton crew. But despite the scanty help, the lobby itself had been filled to the brim with hospital beds, stretchers, and wheelchairs, all occupied by other, unconscious people. "What's happening here?" I asked as we struggled to find a free bed.
"We don't know. Half the staff simply didn't show up for work, and the rest are acting strangely, refusing to stop staring up at the moon. It doesn't make any sense."
He pointed to a few nurses and doctors running from patient to patient, desperately trying to figure out what ailed them.
"This is all we have left,"
he said. My wife, she going to... Will she be all right?" I asked. The doctor didn't answer. It was beyond what any of them had ever dealt with, and it clearly showed. Our town had been ravaged by an impossible, senseless disease with an unknown cause. I sat with my wife for hours, and by some stroke of luck, we managed to find her a room occupied by only 5 other patients, all apparently suffering from the same condition. None awakened from their forced slumber. After a while, I decided to get some fresh air. I needed to think, to come up with a solution, and at almost 3 in the morning, I ventured outside for a cigarette, a habit I'd quit years earlier. But desperate times call for desperate measures. On my way, one of the doctors stopped me.
"Where are you going?"
"Out for a smoke. Why?" He shook his head in frustration, as tired and burnt out as the others.
"Just don't look up at the sky, all right?"
I nodded and walked outside, staring at my feet for each step. As I inhaled the toxic smoke, I felt a smidge less horrified, and after 3 cigarettes, I forgot why I ever quit. I firmly kept my eyes on the ground, the ambulances, the buildings, anything but the sky. Alas, in the window of the entrance, I saw the reflection of our bright lunar body, and that was all it took. I looked up at the moon. It had been the one that transfixed the animals, my wife, and probably all the other people suffering. During the past few days, I'd spent a lot of time looking up at it, wondering what kind of mysteries had driven people from their health and sanity. And then, for the first time, I noticed something different. They hadn't been staring at the moon at all. But something beside it. Something new. Next to the moon hung a massive black sphere, only visible due to the illuminated outline created as the moonlight reflected off it. I could only barely see it, but nevertheless, there it was, growing ever so slightly with each passing minute. I should have been horrified. I should have ran back into the hospital, but I couldn't. It was just too beautiful. Perfectly spherical, with shades of black surrounding its ever-glowing aura. It was hypnotic. I couldn't stop looking at it. Hours passed, and the moon descended below the horizon, replaced by a glowing orb of sunshine, taking the magnificent sphere with it. I only then realized that I'd stared, unblinking and unmoving, at the object in the sky for the entire night. And it made me feel happy. I spent the night unwillingly staring at the moon. My wife is still unconscious, but it no longer worries me. My only priority is that incredible sphere. Whatever it is, something awakened within me when I first laid eyes upon it, and I know in my heart when nightfall comes, I won't be strong enough to resist looking up into the sky to look for that black sphere. That's why I'm writing this now, while I'm still myself. Whatever you do, when the night creeps over your home like a blanket of darkness, stay inside. Don't look up at the sky.